Our next speaker is Dr. Linda Teplin, the Owen L. Kuhn Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Feinberg School of Medicine, Northwestern University, where she is also the Vice Chair for Research in the Department of Psychiatry and Director of the program Health Disparities in Public Policy. Since receiving her PhD from Northwestern University in 1975, she has focused on special populations seldom examined in prior studies. In addition to publishing papers in widely disseminated professional journals, her work has been cited in reports of the Surgeon General, used in amicus briefs to the Supreme Court, presented in congressional hearings, and widely disseminated by federal agencies and advocacy groups. Doctor?
Thank you so much. My mother could not have done better. And actually, the only one who calls me doctor is my mother. Yes, so thank you. So I'm the kind of switch gears speaker. This morning and the last session was all about adults in the criminal justice system. And I and the next two speakers will be talking about youth in the juvenile justice system. Well, I'm a researcher, and the first thing I do when I'm ever asked to speak is a reflex. I do a lit search. So Ellen invited me to speak on the criminalization of mental disorder. So the first thing I did when I got off the phone was do a lit search, and this is what I found. We searched the literature for all the articles that used the word criminalization, criminalized mentally ill, criminalized mental disorder. We even spelled it with an S to make sure we would pick up articles that were published in the UK or in Australia or New Zealand. Even so, look at this chart. What we see with this chart, and I'm a researcher, I love data, so this chart amazes me and dismays me at the same time. Because what we see is that there has been a peak of interest in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the number of articles, and this is empirical or lit reviews, have fallen down substantially since then, because I think few people care. So the first thing I would like to do is to thank Ellen for convening this meeting on what is such an important topic, because so few people care. The other thing I noticed when I did my lit review is that virtually all of these articles were on adults. Very few of these papers address the issue of mental health needs, and especially nothing on mental health outcomes of youth in the juvenile justice system. So today, I'll be presenting findings from our study, the Northwestern Juvenile Project, which I joke is not the only study looking at, is not only the first study looking at mental health needs and outcomes of juvenile justice kids, but actually one of the very few. So let me give you a very brief review of the literature in this area, because again, as a researcher, I like to know, why do this study? Why is it important to do this study? So when we first developed the Northwestern Juvenile Project, we looked at the literature and we found many, many articles with delinquent in their title. But when we looked closer, we found that virtually all of those looked at general population youth to see who becomes delinquent. And the much smaller literature looking at delinquent kids, actual samples of delinquent kids, most often were conducted by criminologists who, although many are my favorite people, do not typically study mental health needs and outcomes. So what I realized, and this was back in the mid-90s, that we knew extremely little about the mental health needs of kids when they entered detention and after. And this is a particularly important question because we know that most kids in the juvenile justice system leave after about 2 weeks. And then they're back in the community, becoming a burden for the community mental health system. It's not just a problem for the juvenile justice system. Now, I also want to explain to you why my research group decided to focus on delinquent kids. And there's 2 reasons. The first reason is in terms of sheer numbers. So if we look at the numbers of cases disposed between 1985 and more recently, we see that it's dropped, but we still have about 1.4 million juvenile cases disposed every year. About 1.4 million. The one-day count of offenders, again, it's dropped, but still on an average day, it's 71,000 kids. The second reason that I wanted to focus on this issue is actually something that I'm surprised has not been brought up before, and that is the issue of disproportionate incarceration of minorities. When we talk about people in the criminal justice system, juvenile justice system, we are talking about racial and ethnic minorities, especially African Americans, and to a somewhat lesser extent Hispanics, being disproportionately incarcerated. I have many slides on this, but I chose this one because it's so telling. What this shows is that African Americans comprise about 13% of youth and adults in the general population, but about 40% of youth and adults in corrections. I find this absolutely astonishing. And so when we are talking about criminalization of the mentally ill, we are talking about that especially affecting minorities. And my work has been devoted to addressing that particular issue. So today, I'll be presenting data from our major research project called the Northwestern Juvenile Project, and I'll be presenting information to you on psychiatric disorders, on positive outcomes, on negative outcomes such as recidivism, and then I will end by suggesting some directions for future research, as well as talking about implications for public health policy, all in 30 minutes. So let me tell you a little bit about our study. It's a very straightforward, simple study. We took a random sample of kids, a little bit over 1,800 kids, as they entered the detention center in Cook County in the mid-90s. They were between 10 and 18 years old, and people always say, well, why did you choose Cook County? Is it that bad? The reason is that we chose Cook County because it's typical. It's a typical big city with typical big city problems. We also like Cook County because it has great diversity in terms of Latinos. So we have great ethnic diversity among Latinos. And then lastly, and I say this no matter what, even if I'm not speaking in Cook County, we have great cooperation there. And when you do large-scale longitudinal studies like the Northwestern Juvenile Project, you need to have great participation, or you just can't do the study. Our participants, this slide shows that, and I want to just deal briefly with our sampling strategy. We took a random sample, but we oversampled girls because otherwise we would not have gotten enough to be able to compare their mental health needs and outcomes to boys. We oversampled younger kids. We oversampled kids who were processed in adult court. And lastly, we oversampled non-Hispanic whites, because had we not, we would have ended up with far too non-Hispanic white kids to analyze. So this shows the sample as we sampled them. And you see we have a very good breakdown in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of gender, in terms of age. And I want to just note for those statisticians in the crowd that when we actually analyze the data, we weight everything back to the true proportions of these demographic characteristics in the detention center. I also want to highlight that when we re-interviewed our kids, and this is important, we re-interviewed them wherever they were when their interview was due. And that's critical because many, many longitudinal studies, when their subjects become incarcerated, they're just lost to follow-up. And so what happens is that the researchers are forced to omit the very participants who have the worst possible outcomes. So in our study, we were fortunate to be able to re-interview our kids wherever they lived, whether it meant running up 7 floors of a housing project in urine-soaked hallways or trekking downstate to an adult correctional facility. Pretty much nobody was lost. We had terrific participation rates. At the initial interview, we only had a refusal rate of about 2% of the kids and about 3.8% of the caretakers. And that's because for so many of these kids, it's the first time they had someone actually talk to them. So that oftentimes when we made arrangements to pay the kids for the interview, we paid them $15 plus $10 for a urine sample, which we tested for drugs. Many of them said, "You don't have to pay me, it's enough you listened." So as a consequence, we had a terrific participation rate, and even at follow-up, our participation rates were between 84 and 97%, depending on the follow-up. I'll be talking a lot about psychiatric disorders, which we assessed using various structured interviews. The exact interview changed as the kids aged, but these are the disorders that we assessed over time. Let's talk about the findings, none of which are going to make any of us happy about the state of the juvenile justice system, or the systems, in fact, that serve youth in the community. So what we see, this shows the gender differences of psychiatric disorders, and these are disorders, not just symptoms, in our sample of 1,829 kids. As I mentioned, they were 10 to 17 at baseline, and what we see, if you look at the bottom, is that about 3/4 of the girls and 2/3 of the boys had one or more of the disorders that I had shown you on the prior slide. This slide shows, again, disorders at the baseline interview, looking at racial and ethnic differences among the boys. And what we see is that there are some interesting and unfortunate racial and ethnic differences here, where for some disorders, the whites, the non-Hispanic whites, have higher rates of disorder. And I think that's because that, unfortunately, for a black kid to end up in the juvenile justice system, you don't have to be as messed up as a white kid to end up in the juvenile justice system. However, let's remember that the actual sheer numbers of minority kids are huge compared to the sheer numbers of non-Hispanic white kids who have mental health needs, who are in the juvenile justice system. This slide shows the differences in prevalence rates, again at the baseline, among girls, again looking at racial and ethnic differences. By the way, for any of you who want more information, I'll be glad to send you our articles. Just pop me an email and I'll send them to you. This is a chart that researchers love and everybody else hates, but let me explain to you why this is a very bad news chart, and it's quite easy to understand. These circles each represent one of the 4 types of disorders. What we see is that the circles overlap to a great extent. This means that most of the kids, boys and girls, had at the baseline interview, when they were between 10 and 17 years of age, not just one type of disorder, but most often 2 or more types of disorder. So this is a very bad news chart because of the overlap and because of the degree of overlap. It shows that many of these kids have comorbid disorders, which make them much more difficult to treat than if they just had one disorder. We also looked at what proportion of kids who had a serious mental disorder, and by serious I mean a major affective disorder, manic episode, a very serious mental disorder, what proportion of those kids either received treatment in the detention center or within 6 months of release in the community? It was about 1 in 6, even though we set the bar so high in terms of defining need for mental health services. There were also dramatic racial and ethnic differences in who received needed mental health services. So we found that girls were much more likely to receive services than boys. And also we found that the person least likely to receive services was an African American male, age 15 or 16. The most likely person to receive services, the most likely flavor of kid, was a non-Hispanic white female. Childhood maltreatment, as we all know, extremely prevalent in this sample, although, and we have a paper on this, rarely reported. IQ, very depressing. You can hardly see the little line at the top, which is the proportion of the sample that had an above average IQ. You can hardly see it. It's that little tiny, it almost looks like the top of the graph, but that's actually the proportion of kids who were above average. Nearly 80% of the sample were below average. This is a paper from a recent article of ours, and it is good news, partly. This shows the prevalence rates of major mood and anxiety disorders over time, looking at the baseline, 3 years later, 5 years later. And we see a couple of things here. We see that rates dramatically drop, and this is very good news. But we also see that prevalence rates are still much higher than the general population. This graph shows major mood and anxiety disorders. And this graph shows substance use disorder and disruptive behavior disorder. I also want to highlight an interesting gender difference here, which is that remember that girls had higher prevalence rates of disorders than boys at baseline. But as time goes on, many of the disorders dropped more dramatically among girls. And so you see the difference between the pink and blue lines, that they cross at a certain point. So that at follow-up, it's the boys that have the higher prevalence rates of substance use disorders, for example. Comorbidity at the baseline interview, and this is from 5 years later. This is arguing with me. Okay? Again, this is a Venn diagram showing the overlap, and this is somewhat better news. You see that the overlap is less at the follow-up than at the baseline interview. This means that comorbid disorders have dropped. But again, rates are still much higher in the general than in the general population. And this is the case for males. And although the pattern is different, it's also the case for females. Again, see how there's less overlap at the 5-year interview, called the time to interview in this slide. This looks at specific substance use disorders. You may remember that at the baseline interview, about half the girls and boys had a substance use disorder. And that's not use, that's disorder. So we looked over time, and this is up to the 12-year follow-up interview. And I want to highlight a couple of things here. which is that the prevalence of what we call other drug use disorders is much lower than people commonly think. In this sample, the most prevalent substance use disorders were alcohol and marijuana. We have this image, especially of minorities, that crack cocaine is very common in terms of disorder, heroin very common, almost non-existent, especially among the African Americans. When there were racial ethnic differences, the rates were always higher among non-Hispanic whites at baseline and at follow-up. Really makes you rethink our policy in terms of the war on drugs. We see the same thing with females. We see that the prevalence drops. This is very good news, still much higher than general population rates. And again, we see that the most common disorders are alcohol use disorder and marijuana. And again, this is disorder, not use. We looked at positive outcomes. And unfortunately, this is not going to give you any better news. We looked at educational attainment, and this is for 6 years after baseline. Employment, assistance, nonviolent personal relationships, residential stability, and psychological well-being. And the bar was very low. We first ran the data actually where a desistance was desistance from any crime, and nobody stayed. The prevalence was about 0. So we had to increase it, or rather lower the bar, so that it was desisting from violent crime. And even so, even though we set the bar so low, only 9% of our sample had achieved 5 to 6 of the positive outcomes. Reincarceration, extremely common in this sample. This is 5 years later, and we see it's extremely high among the males, and especially among African Americans. 90% of the African American males were reincarcerated 1 or more times within 5 years of the baseline interview. Now, you can't read this slide. Maybe people in the first row can read it. 10 years ago, you could read this slide. This slide lists the deaths of the kids in our sample. So you could have read it 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you could have read it 15 years ago. You can't read it now because to date, of the 1,829 kids that we sampled, 120 have died. 120. This death rate is unheard of in a sample of people this young. They have the death rate of 74-year-old men. Most of the deaths were from homicide by firearm. So this shows the prevalence, the type of death for girls in our sample and boys in our sample. Cause of death compared to the general population. On the left are the kids in our study, and on the right is the cause of death in general population males. This is for males. And compared to the general population, we see that rates are about 4 to 5 times higher than the general population, not for African Americans. And that's because even in the general population, the death rate is so high among African American youth. Females, cause of death, again, comparison to the general population. Homicide was very often the cause. In our sample, mortality among Hispanic girls was 12 times general population rates. In terms of risk factors, this is a survival curve, literally a survival curve. And what this shows is that having alcohol use disorder at the baseline interview was a significant predictor of early violent death. Let me finish with just a few recommendations for public health policy. The first implication is not for the juvenile justice system, but actually for the larger systems that serve youth. So many of these kids should never be in detention. We sampled kids for 2.5 years, and we never got a kid from the wealthy northern suburbs, ever, in 2.5 years. We had to stay an extra 6 months just to fill our cell of non-Hispanic whites. And even then we didn't, we just gave up. So who's detained? It's kids who are poor. It's kids who are disproportionately of color. If I'd gotten into trouble when I was a kid, probably I would not have been detained. My parents, although not wealthy, were sophisticated enough and would have done anything to secure treatment for me to make sure that I didn't fall into the juvenile justice net. So the first implication for the system is for the larger system that serves kids. That means primary care, schools, child welfare, as well as the larger mental health system. Because then these kids will be less likely to fall through the cracks into the juvenile justice net. Now, if these kids end up detained, obviously the detention center has a legal obligation to provide adequate screening, to provide adequate mental health services, including services that are different for girls and boys, services that treat optimally kids with comorbid disorders. But I think the most important implication here is the failure to provide linkage to the community services when kids leave. And let's remember, these kids stay, as I mentioned, an average of 2 weeks. And then they become a burden for the mental health system. Well, people have asked me a lot, well, won't health care reform help these kids? I've thought a lot about that. And, you know, the typical academic's answer is, well, maybe. But let me take you through that. On the one hand, here are the negatives. Federal law prohibits Medicaid payments for people, juveniles and adults, who are in correctional institutions. And we all know that incarceration disrupts community treatment and often Medicaid benefits. Also, the Congressional Budget Office, and this is after the Supreme Court decision, projects that 30 million non-elderly residents, that's the term that they use, which means undocumented immigrants, people with low incomes who fail to enroll in Medicaid, all these people will remain uninsured in the year 2016. This is even with health care reform. Also, health care reform does not improve the deteriorating public health infrastructure where a lot of these poor kids, and then when they're adults, poor adults, would receive treatment after they're released from corrections. On the positive side, though, again, academics can never fail to see less than two sides on anything. We can expect a lot of our kids, quote unquote, to be receiving services in the community than before health care reform. So why is that? We have insurance now up to age 26. Also, many states will have an incentive to expand Medicaid, even though the Supreme Court ruled they don't have to. But I think the crucial question is the public health system ready for our kids? For kids like the ones that I've described to you today? Is the system ready to provide the array of services needed for our population of juveniles? Highly comorbid, many abused and neglected, poorly educated, low IQs, at high risk for a multitude of dire outcomes as they age. This, I see, is what the challenge of the future is. Okay, thank you very much. Depressing.
I have about 40 years experience with this population. I worked in the late 60s and 70s with some of the best gang leader or programs in the United States. I taught in all the roughest schools in LA. Bought a youth house right across the street. In the last 10 years, I've worked as a prison psychologist. Forgot a little bit I was going to say. I'll tell you, for the most part, the psychologists work for the Department of Corrections don't care. They just don't care. They talk down about the inmates all the time. They've taken on the same mentality as the correctional officers. I run a program there myself for guys that have been in and out of prison upwards of 40 times. And when they're through with my program, they don't come back for the most part. And what these guys need more than anything else is a big brother, father figure in their life. They're just dying for it. And when I hear all through here with that one judge and the people here and a couple other instances, the people that really care about these people and spend the extra time that makes the program work. And I know some of the programs are really needed, but these guys are just dying for people that really care for them in their life.
Yeah. And that's been our experience as well. That's why our participation rate initially and ongoing was so high. Yes.
Yeah, hello, William Chair. One day we present the information about the juveniles. I always perceive African Americans as using cocaine, but here in your study, most of them did not use cocaine. And is a lot of times the wealthy African Americans, like the athletes in the movie saw, they don't get incarcerated. They don't end up in prison and jail. Very few of them. But usually they have good lawyers and they get out and they get encountered with the justice system. They get out real quickly. But the poor one, they don't have any representation, legal representation.
I couldn't agree more.
Yes, and Cook County is in the Chicago area, Illinois, and most black kids, most African-American kids, when they go downstate Illinois, most of the white kids, when they go downstate Illinois, they're going to college. They're going to University of Illinois, Urbana, or some of the school, SIU, Southern Illinois University. But most of the African-American kids go down state. They're either going to jail or they're going to a basketball tournament. So that's my comment.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I work for the Department of Mental Health, and I was part of AB 3632, the program that was defunded by the governor. And I was in charge of assessing and often placing children that were connected to the school district. My program was defunded, and the reason I came up here, I cannot ethically leave this room today and let you know that there were thousands of children left without services after we were defunded. These children were dumped at the school districts for mental health services that needed to be implemented and delivered by the county, the state, and the federal government. Many times as an assessor, I was the one who went to see children that were ready to throw themselves from buildings, that had locked themselves in rooms because they were suicidal. And oftentimes, I would leave people homes, I would leave school knowingly that these kids will not get any services. Now, so I wrote the last part of my statement. I think the larger and provocative question should be that we need to frame really the dialogue and sort of shift the perspective, and that is who is truly in charge of providing services to these children. Because when young men come in the news and they walk into a school and they shoot people, then society suddenly becomes responsible for them. So I think the dialogue should begin. We need to look at these children and create the programs, and for God's sake, fund the programs that need to be put in place so that we can rescue them before they end up in the juvenile system or any other system. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments.
Hi, I just want to comment, and the last person that she mentioned the importance of dialogue, and I'm actually a staff here at USC, and I'm proud to say that also with a professor here at the sociology department, Pierrette, we're looking at community gardens and the importance of community gardens, particularly here in the Pico Union area, which is our backyard for USC. And for about 2 years now, I've been meeting with undocumented youth who come from Guatemala. And these youth are unaccompanied. They came here, most of them at the age of 14, and work in the garment district. And your last data showing who are going to be displaced, and I can't but think about these youth who I meet every Friday who don't have health insurance, who at first were showing symptoms of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, and how this community garden, simply by having a safe space for them to go, and I also have a BA in psychology, and here I am, trying to see how can I help them in a therapeutic way. I'm not a licensed clinician, but I do, just simply as planting vegetables, it's something that's helping them, or doing activities such as growing corn, and throwing, some type of activity that could help them, talk about their, daily issues at work, being exploited, getting, paid $200 a week. So what I want to say is that we're all actors of change, and we just got to look around, because I feel that as a society, or, we're so dependent on the government that, we have to look beyond and see what we could do as community members, and abroad and here. But just wanted to say thank you for actually doing the research and considering, undocumented youth and pointing that out, because I feel that a lot of youth have been falling through the cracks, and
yes,
we need more scientific research that proves that.
Well, thank you. Also, unfortunately, I mentioned we had very high participation rates, but we lost some kids when they were deported.
Thank you
Yes.
so much. What a wonderful study.
Thank you.
I'm going to start by there's so many passionate people here, and I'm so proud to be here among everybody today. I really feel a great sense of responsibility among everybody here. And as a parent who has dealt with this with a child from, here on to here, first I want to say that the need clearly doesn't equate to treatment. Great data doesn't equate to care. So where are we going to take, this is the first little seeds I want to throw out over the fence a little bit, is how do we as parents who don't have the purse strings take the data and translate that into adequate care, because there's a very big divide between all the data over here and nothing happening on this side. So that's one point. The responsibility within us all to not stop at when we know too much. And then my question really specifically for all the youth is, where were they at the point of the study when it started? Had any of them been out of state in a residential? Were they institutionalized? Were they just at home in the community? Was it their first incarceration? Like our son, and when I think of him being 12, he was out of state, but then he would come home. He could have been incarcerated during a home visit. There's children shot when they're visiting their families. I saw homicide by gun as the #1 death mortality rate, no surprise, but I don't see anywhere in there where that could have been death by police.
We actually had one.
So,
we had one youth who was killed by police.
So that was not even part of it. But so what was this what did they look like? at the time of the study? Was it kids at home?
No, these were kids who were arrested and newly detained.
Newly detained.
At Cook County Detention Center.
Newly detained, okay.
And we purposely sampled that population because we wanted to differentiate between the consequences of incarceration on mental health and mental health need at the time of arrest.
Okay.
So we sampled all the kids at the same point in time.
Got it.
Newly arrested juvenile detainees.
I missed that. I'm sorry. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.